The moment Stella Vaughn stepped off the stage at Junction, with a trunk full of hope and a heart full of dread, she knew something about this arrangement had never felt entirely right. It was the spring of 1878, and the Arizona Territory stretched out in every direction like a vast, sun-scorched promise that could just as easily become a threat. The desert was alive that morning, painted in shades of amber and rust, the kind of beauty that made a person feel very small and strangely grateful all at once. Stella pressed a gloved hand to the brim of her bonnet and surveyed the dusty street of Junction with the practiced composure of a woman who had learned, somewhere between Pennsylvania and this God-forsaken outpost, that appearances were the only currency she had left. She was 23 years old. She had brown hair that never quite stayed pinned, eyes the color of a storm rolling in over the flats, and a stubborn set to her jaw that her late mother had called willful and her late father had called admirable. She had been neither willful nor admirable in the last year. She had simply been surviving. The letter from Mr. Gerald Holt had arrived 8 months ago, introduced through a matrimonial correspondence service out of Denver. Gerald Holt was 41, a cattle rancher in the town of Salters Creek, and he had described himself as prosperous, decent, and in need of a capable wife. Stella had described herself as educated, hard-working, and unafraid of frontier life. Both of them had been partially truthful. She suspected Gerald had left out certain qualities. She knew she had left out certain fears. The arrangement had been made, the date set, and Stella had sold most of what she owned, packed the rest into the trunk now sitting in the dust beside her boots, and traveled west. It had taken 3 weeks by rail, by stage, and by sheer determination. Now she stood at the last junction before Salters Creek, which was, according to the station master, another 42 miles south through terrain that required a guide. "Miss Vaughn," the voice came from behind her, and she turned to find a man leaning against the post of the junction's sorry excuse for a hotel, arms crossed, hat pulled low against the morning glare. He was tall and lean in the way that the desert made men lean, all of the excess burned away, and something harder and quieter left behind. He wore a dark vest over a faded blue shirt, and his boots were the boots of a man who had covered serious ground in them. A silver star was pinned to his vest, though it was a deputy's star from a county she did not recognize. "I am she," Stella said, straightening her spine. He pushed off the post and crossed to her, extending a hand that was calloused and tanned. "Simon Winslow. Marshal Greer hired me to escort you down to Salters Creek. Your fiancé sent word asking for a safe rider." She shook his hand. It was a firm, honest grip, the kind that didn't linger or perform. "How long will the journey take?" 3 days if the weather holds and we take the southern pass. 2.5 if we push hard, but I wouldn't recommend it. The canyon roads are not kind to horses in a hurry." She studied him for a moment. He had a face that had spent considerable time outdoors, weathered but not unkindly so, with dark eyes that took in information quickly and gave away very little. She guessed him to be somewhere close to 30, though the sun made it difficult to be certain. 3 days, she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the trunk. She looked at the open country beyond the town. She thought about Gerald Holt's letters, which had been polite and thorough, and had somehow never once made her feel anything except obligated. "When do we leave?" she asked. "First light tomorrow," Simon said. "I've arranged a room for you at the Juniper House tonight. Get some rest. The trail demands it." She thanked him with the same composed courtesy she had been maintaining for weeks and followed the station master's boy to the Juniper House, where she sat on a narrow bed and listened to the desert wind and wondered, not for the first time, whether she was making the greatest mistake of her life or the most sensible decision in it. She could not yet tell the difference. The morning came in with a cold blue light and the smell of coffee that the proprietress of the Juniper House, a stout woman named Mrs. Crane, pressed into Stella's hands without being asked. Stella drank it standing on the porch, watching Simon Winslow load her trunk onto a pack horse with practiced efficiency. He had a second horse saddled and ready for her, a steady-looking bay mare with a white blaze down her nose. "Her name is Biscuit," Simon said, noticing Stella studying the animal. "She's steady and she doesn't spook. Good trail horse." "I can ride," Stella said. It came out more defensively than she had intended. He glanced at her without judgment. "I didn't say you couldn't." She felt a small flush of embarrassment and decided to say nothing further. She mounted without assistance and settled herself into the saddle with the ease of a woman who had indeed grown up on horseback, even if the horses of Pennsylvania farm country were considerably less dramatic about the landscape than Arizona. They left Redrock Junction as the sun broke the horizon, painting everything in fierce orange and gold, and rode south in comfortable silence for the first hour. The desert was extraordinary in the early light. Saguaro cactus stood along the ridgelines like sentinels, their arms raised in postures that seemed, depending on the angle, either welcoming or warning. The sky above was the deep, saturated blue of a color that Stella had never seen in the East, a blue so clean and vast it made her chest ache with something she could not name. Simon rode slightly ahead, reading the terrain with the ease of a man who had done this 100 times. She watched his back and the unhurried way he sat the saddle and found herself curious about him in the way she was curious about people who did not immediately explain themselves. "Have you ridden this route before?" she asked after a while. "Many times," he said. "I've been working this territory for 6 years. Used to be with the Texas Rangers before I came north." "Why did you leave Texas?" A pause, not evasive but thoughtful. Change of scenery. She accepted that. People in the West rarely explained themselves fully, and she had learned to respect the economy of that. "What do you know about Salters Creek?" she asked. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "It's a working cattle town, about 400 people, decent water source, which is more than most towns out here can say. The Holt Ranch is about 3 miles east of town. Big operation. And Mr. Holt himself." Another pause, this one different from the first. "I've met him once or twice." And she waited. "And he runs a good ranch," Simon said, with the careful tone of a man who was answering the question he had been asked and not the one that was meant. She understood him perfectly. "Is he a good man?" she asked more directly. Simon looked at her then, turning in the saddle enough to meet her eyes. The morning light was behind her and his expression was serious and frank. "He's a prosperous man," he said. "Those two things don't always travel together." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her about this entire arrangement, and she found it simultaneously comforting and deeply unsettling. They rode on. By midday they had covered 12 miles, and the terrain had shifted from the open flats to the beginning of the canyon country, where the red rock walls rose on either side, and the trail narrowed to a path wide enough for one horse at a time. Simon navigated it without hesitation, and Stella followed his lead, watching the way his hands were easy on the reins, and the way he read every shift in the ground before it registered under his horse's feet. They ate lunch in the shade of a rock overhang, hardtack and dried beef, and water from a canteen, which was not elegant but was genuinely welcome. Stella had stopped being particular about elegance somewhere in Nevada. "You're not what I expected," she said when they had eaten and the horses were resting. He looked at her from under the brim of his hat. "What did you expect?" "Someone older, more like a hired hand." Less like she stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence without it sounding like a compliment she had not intended to offer. "Less like what?" he asked, and there was a quiet amusement in his voice that was not unkind. "Less like a person who forms opinions," she said finally. He considered this. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It is simply unexpected." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're not what I expected either." "What did you expect?" "Someone frightened," he said simply. "Most women who come out on arrangements like this are frightened by the time they get to the junction. You don't seem frightened." She looked out at the canyon walls, at the ancient red stone layered in strata that represented more time than either of them could meaningfully imagine. "I am frightened," she said. "I have simply decided that being frightened in a useful way is preferable to being frightened in a useless one." He looked at her steadily, and something shifted in his expression, something subtle and private, as though she had confirmed a thought he had not yet finished forming. "That is a sensible philosophy," he said. "It is the only one I have been able to afford," she replied. They broke camp and rode on. The first night they made camp at a place Simon called Archer's Spring, where a cluster of cottonwood trees stood around a shallow seep of clear water, an improbable and beautiful thing in the middle of all that stone and heat. The cottonwoods shimmered silver in the evening breeze, and the spring made a quiet sound that was almost musical. Simon built the fire with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times in 1,000 places, and Stella unsaddled the horses and picketed them in the grass near the spring, and neither of them needed to discuss the division of labor because it simply arranged itself according to competence, which she appreciated more than she could say. He cooked bacon and beans in a pan over the fire, and she made the coffee, and they sat across the fire from each other in the cooling desert evening, with the stars coming out overhead in numbers that seemed impossible, as though every star that had ever been promised by any poet had been saved specifically for the Arizona sky. "How long have you been arranged to Mr. Holt?" he asked. "The correspondence has been 8 months," she said. "We have never met in person." "That's not unusual out here," he said. "A lot of marriages are made that way." "I know," she said. "I know it is practical, and I know there is precedent. I know all of the logical reasons it is a sound decision." She paused, watching the fire. "I know all of those things." "But," he said, and his voice was very quiet. She looked up at him across the fire. The flames lit the planes of his face and made his dark eyes look very alive, very present. "But I sometimes wonder what it would feel like to make a decision that was not entirely logical," she said. "To choose something because it felt right rather than because it made sense." He held her gaze for a long moment. The fire crackled. Out in the dark beyond the cottonwoods, an owl called once and was silent. "That's a brave thing to admit," he said. "Or a foolish one," she said. "Sometimes they're the same thing," he replied. She went asleep that night in her bedroll on the far side of the fire with Simon's voice still warm in her ears, and the stars wheeling overhead and the spring murmuring its quiet song. And she felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a person who was genuinely present in her own life, rather than simply being carried along by it. The second day began with a problem. Simon discovered it at first light when he went to check the horses. The pack horse, the animal carrying Stella's trunk, had thrown a shoe in the night, likely caught on a sharp stone near the spring, and was standing with one foreleg cocked and a patient expression that said very clearly that it was not going anywhere quickly. Stella stood beside Simon and looked at the horse and looked at the trail ahead and did not panic, which he noted. "Can you re-shoe him?" she asked. "I have the tools but not the replacement shoe for this size," he said. "I'll need to wrap the hoof and walk him slow for part of the day. It will add time." "How much time?" "Half a day, maybe more. We may need a 4th day." She looked at the horizon, at the direction of Salters Creek, and then back at the horse. "Is there a settlement between here and there?" "There's a trading post at Mesquite Crossing," he said. "About 8 miles east of our route. Trader named Ambrose Prout usually keeps supplies. He might have a shoe that fits." "Then we go east," she said without hesitation. He looked at her with that steady, evaluating look she was beginning to recognize. "It adds miles." "The horse needs a proper shoe," she said. "We go east." He almost smiled. She could see it in the corners of his eyes even if his mouth did not fully commit to it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They adjusted their route, Simon leading the pack horse slowly along a dry creek bed that served as a path east, and Stella riding Biscuit beside him because the terrain did not require a lead rider, and it was simply more pleasant to talk than to ride in single file. "Tell me something true about yourself," she said, after they had been riding for an hour. He thought about it genuinely, which she liked. He did not give an immediate polished answer. "I was born in Georgia," he said finally. "My family lost everything in the war. I was 14. I came west when I was 17 with about $12 and a horse that was half blind." "What happened to the horse?" "Lived to be 22, he said. Finest animal I ever had." She smiled at that, a real one, not the composed social smile she had been wearing for months. "And the Rangers, when did that begin?" "When I was 21. A captain named Hollies took me on because I could track and I didn't argue with orders. I worked the border country for 5 years." "You said you left for a change of scenery," she said. "That was not the whole story." He glanced at her and she could see he was deciding something. "No," he said, "it wasn't." He was quiet for a moment and the dry creek bed carried the sound of the horse's careful footsteps. "There was a woman," he said, "in San Antonio. We were going to be married. She died of fever before it happened. After that, Texas was just a collection of places where she had been." Stella felt the weight of it settle between them, the kind of grief that does not announce itself loudly but sits quietly in the bones of a person and reshapes the way they move through the world. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it entirely. "It was 4 years ago," he said. "Time has a way of changing the shape of things. It doesn't make them smaller, but it makes them more possible to carry." She thought about her own losses, her parents, her family's farm, the life she had imagined that had turned out not to be available to her. "Yes," she said. "I know something about that." They rode in silence for a while, but it was a different kind of silence from the one that had accompanied the beginning of the journey. This silence was companionable and warm, the silence of two people who had said something real to each other and were resting in the space it had opened. Mesquite Crossing proved to be a collection of 4 rough buildings around a yard, with a corral and a water trough, and a trading post that smelled of dried herbs and leather, and the sharp sweetness of cheap whiskey. Ambrose Prout was a wide man of about 60 with a thick beard and small, clever eyes, and he greeted them from the doorway of the post with a rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. "Winslow," he said, recognizing Simon. "Didn't expect you this way." "Horse threw a shoe," Simon said. "You got a number 2 with a wide toe." Prout looked at the pack horse and squinted. "Might have. Come in, come in." He looked at Stella with frank curiosity. "Traveling through." "On our way to Salters Creek," Simon said. "Ah," something crossed Prout's face, some small flicker of an opinion that he chose not to voice. He led them inside. Stella browsed the shelves of the trading post while Simon and Prout negotiated over the horseshoe, running her fingers over bolts of calico, tins of tobacco, a collection of glass bottles that caught the dusty light. On a shelf near the back she found a small, battered book of poetry, the spine cracked and the cover faded to an indeterminate color. She opened it and found a page marked with a dried desert flower. She read the marked poem, something by an English poet about the nature of home and belonging, and felt a sudden, sharp ache that she could not entirely account for. "Find something worth having?" Simon asked, appearing at her shoulder. She showed him the book. He looked at it and then at her, and something in his expression was careful and attentive. "I used to read a great deal," she said. "Before everything changed, I had a library, small but mine." She replaced the book on the shelf. "Practical concerns take precedence." "Buy it," he said. "It's not necessary." "Lots of things that matter aren't necessary," he said. "Buy the book, Miss Vaughn." She looked at him for a moment, this quiet, frank man with his honest eyes and his careful way of speaking, and she felt something stir in her chest that she firmly directed her attention away from. She bought the book. Prout reshoed the pack horse in the yard, while Simon applied a thin wrap of rawhide to the hoof as additional support, and Stella sat on a fence post and read the first 3 poems in the book, and felt like herself in a way she had not felt in a long time. When they set out again, the sun was high and the day was hot, and they made camp that second night at a place called Redwall Mesa, where the canyon country opened briefly into a broad, shallow basin, and the rock walls were the color of dried blood, and the shadows they threw were long and dramatic as the sun went down. This night was different from the first. Perhaps it was the book, and the conversation that followed from it. Simon asking what she had read back in Pennsylvania, and she asking what he had read on the trail, and discovering that he kept a tattered copy of Emerson in his saddlebag that he had been carrying for 3 years. Perhaps it was the way the sunset lit the mesa walls in shades of copper and violet so extraordinary that they both simply stopped talking for 10 minutes and watched it together in the same silence a person would use in a church. Perhaps it was when Stella's coffee boiled over and she burned her hand, not badly but sharply, and Simon crossed to her without hesitation, took her hand in both of his, turned it to the firelight to examine it, and held it there for a moment longer than strictly necessary, his thumbs very gently testing the reddened skin. "It's not a serious burn," he said, his voice slightly lower than it had been a moment before. "No," she agreed. Her hand was still in his. He looked up from her hand and found her eyes already on him, and for a long, honest moment neither of them moved or spoke. The fire popped. The desert wind moved through the basin with a soft sound like a held breath released. He released her hand slowly, carefully, as though it were something worth being careful with. "There's salve in the saddlebag," he said. "Thank you," she said. They both looked at the fire for a while. "Tell me about him," Simon said after a time. "What do you know about Gerald Holt beyond the letters?" She thought about it honestly. "He writes neatly," she said. "His letters are always organized, point by point. He is efficient in his communication and clear about what he expects. He mentioned wanting children, but the way he mentioned it was more like listing livestock requirements than." She stopped. "That is an unkind comparison." "It sounds like an accurate one," Simon said quietly. "He has been generous," she said, defending the fairness of her account. "He sent money for my travel. He arranged proper accommodation along the route. He is not cruel in his letters. He is simply," she searched for the word. "Transactional," Simon offered, and she recognized the word like a stone dropping into still water. "Yes," she said, "transactional." She looked at the fire. "Which I have told myself is not the worst foundation. Many marriages are transactional. Many of them work. People grow fond of each other. People build lives." "They do," he agreed. "You think I'm making a mistake," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The owls were out again, calling from somewhere high up in the mesa wall. "I think," he said very carefully, "that you are a woman who deserves more than a man who writes to her like a business proposition." She looked at him across the fire, and the burning in her hand was nothing compared to the burning in her chest, which she recognized with a kind of calm, terrifying clarity. "Simon," she said, using his given name for the first time, and the single word carried all of it. He met her eyes. "Stella," he said, and the word in his voice was like nothing she had ever heard her name be before. They sat with that for a long time, the fire burning down between them and the stars turning slowly overhead, and the desert night full of its own enormous beauty, and nothing more was said. But something had shifted so fundamentally that the world of an hour ago was simply no longer available. She went to her bedroll and lay awake for a long time, listening to the desert breathe and thinking about the 42 miles that lay behind her and the 10 that lay ahead, and the man sleeping 12 feet away with Emerson in his saddlebag and a dead woman in his past, and a way of looking at Stella that made her feel entirely seen. The third day. She woke before first light and made the fire herself and had the coffee on by the time Simon rose, and when he came to the fire and found it ready, he looked at her with a quiet warmth that made the morning, already extraordinary in its blue pre-dawn silence, feel like something close to sacred. They broke camp in an efficient, companionable way, moving around each other with an ease that felt strangely familiar, as though they had been doing this for years rather than 2 days. She handed him the coffee. He handed her the canteen to refill at the edge of the basin spring. She repacked the saddlebag she had used. He checked the horses. It was ordinary domestic cooperation, the kind a person might not even notice unless they were paying close attention, and Stella was paying very close attention. 10 miles today, he said when they mounted. To Salter's Creek, she said. To Salter's Creek, he confirmed, and his voice was perfectly neutral in a way that was not entirely natural. They rode south out of the basin and back into the canyon country, and the trail was broader here, the terrain gentler, the signs of civilization beginning to appear at the edges, a fence line in the distance, the distant sound of cattle, a windmill turning lazily against the sky 3 miles out. Stella rode and thought and was honest with herself about what she was feeling, because dishonesty at this stage seemed not only unkind but genuinely dangerous. She was falling in love with Simon Winslow. She was falling in love with a man she had known for 3 days, which her sensible, practical Pennsylvania mind told her was the height of irrationality, and which everything else in her, the part that had been standing in the desert watching extraordinary sunsets and talking about poetry and feeling her hand held with inexplicable tenderness, told her was the most rational thing she had felt in years. She was also, in approximately 4 hours, going to be delivered to the man she had agreed to marry. The weight of that was considerable. They rode in less easy silence than the mornings before, both of them occupied with their own versions of the same problem, and the 10 miles passed both too quickly and too slowly at once. It was Simon who stopped them, about 3 miles from the first buildings of Salters Creek. He pulled his horse up on a small rise where the valley opened below them, the town visible in the pale morning light, the church steeple, the main street, the stock pens outside of town where cattle moved in slow brown patterns. "We should rest the horses for a moment," he said, which was not entirely true since the horses were not tired. She pulled Biscuit up beside him and they looked down at the town together. "Stella," he said. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "If you say what you're about to say, I will have to decide something I am not yet ready to decide." "You need to decide it before we ride into that town," he said, "because once you do, the deciding is done." She looked at him. His hat was pushed back slightly from the ride, and his face in the morning light was open in a way it had not been when she first saw him against that hotel post, 2.5 days and what felt like an entire previous life ago. There was something in his eyes that she recognized as the same thing she felt in her chest, something careful and honest and large. "Gerald Holt is expecting me," she said. "He is," Simon agreed. "I made an arrangement," she said. "You did." "You were hired to deliver me safely," she said. "I was." He paused. "I have done my job admirably. Despite everything," she almost laughed. "You have," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to tell you what to do, Stella. I wouldn't do that even if I wanted to, and I want very much to. But I will tell you this." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words with great care. "I have not felt this way about another person in 4 years. I had begun to believe I would not feel this way again. And whatever you decide, I need you to know that these 3 days have been." He started again. "I need you to know what they have been to me." She looked at him and felt her composure, which had been her armor for so long, become entirely insufficient. "What have they been to you?" she asked, her voice very quiet. He looked at her with those dark, honest eyes and said, "The beginning of something I did not know I was still capable of." The morning light spread across the valley below them, and Salters Creek sat in it like a thing that had not yet decided whether it was the right destination or the wrong one. Stella breathed in, out. The desert air was clear and sharp and tasted of mineral things, of rock and sky and something alive. "I need to speak with Gerald Holt," she said. Simon's expression did not collapse, but she saw him absorb the words. "I understand," he said. "No," she said. "I need to speak with him because I owe him the honesty of a face-to-face conversation. I cannot simply turn my horse around and ride away from an arrangement I agreed to without looking the man in the eye and saying what needs to be said." She looked at Simon directly. "That is the kind of person I am." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched understanding reach him, and then relief, and then something deeper than either of those things. "Yes," he said, "that is the kind of person you are." "Will you wait for me?" she asked. "Stella," he said, "I would wait considerably longer than one conversation." They rode down into Salters Creek together. The town was larger than it had appeared from the rise, a proper frontier settlement with a bank and a dry goods store and a hotel and a saloon and 2 churches, the smaller of which had a fresh coat of white paint that shone in the morning sun. People moved along the boardwalks in the early commerce of the day, and several of them looked at Simon and Stella as they passed with the frank curiosity of a small town unashamed of its interest in strangers. The Holt Ranch was 3 miles east, but Gerald Holt himself was in town, as they discovered when they asked at the hotel. He had ridden in the previous afternoon, expecting his intended to arrive on the early stage, only to learn that she had taken the southern route with a guide and would be coming in by horseback. He had taken a room at the hotel and was waiting. The desk clerk sent a boy upstairs, and Stella waited in the lobby with her hands folded and her back straight, while Simon waited outside with the horses. The lobby smelled of tobacco and floor wax, and the particular dusty sweetness of a building that was trying to be respectable in an environment that was fundamentally rough. Gerald Holt came down the stairs. He was exactly as she had imagined him, and entirely different at the same time. 41, broad-shouldered, with the careful grooming of a man who took his prosperity seriously, and a face that was not unkind but was, she saw immediately, the face of a man who was fundamentally certain of himself in ways that did not leave room for the kind of conversation she needed to have. "Miss Vaughn," he said, coming toward her with his hand extended and a look of proprietary satisfaction that set something careful in her. "Mr. Holt," she said, shaking his hand. "Thank you for waiting. May we speak privately?" He led her to a small sitting room off the lobby, which held 2 chairs and a window that looked out onto the main street, and Stella saw through that window Simon Winslow standing with the horses at the hitching post, hat forward again, still as the landscape he inhabited. She turned to Gerald Holt. "I owe you honesty," she said, "and I owe you an apology." He sat across from her with a carefully neutral expression that she now recognized as his default state. "That sounds like the beginning of a particular kind of conversation," he said. "It is," she said. "I came out here in good faith. I want you to know that. I intended to honor the arrangement we made, and I came all this way because I meant to." She paused. "Something has changed." He looked at her for a long moment, then out the window, and followed her gaze to the man at the hitching post. His expression was unreadable, not wounded in the way she had feared, but calculating in the way she had expected. "The Escort," he said. "He is a good man," she said. "That is all I will say about that." Gerald Holt laced his fingers together and looked at them for a moment. He was quiet long enough that she could hear the sounds of the town outside, the creak of a wagon, the distant lowing of cattle, somebody dropping something heavy on a wooden floor. "I'm a practical man, Miss Vaughn," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I brought you out here because I needed a capable wife, and the correspondence suggested you were capable." He paused. "The correspondence also suggested you were honest, and it appears that is accurate." Something in his face settled into a kind of resigned pragmatism. "I won't pretend that this is not inconvenient. I won't pretend I am not annoyed." He looked at her directly. "But I won't pretend, either, that I was in love with you. We were 2 practical people making a practical arrangement. The arrangement is not going to hold, and arguing otherwise would waste both our time." She felt a complicated wave of feeling that included gratitude, guilt, and an unexpected respect. "That is very gracious," she said. "It is practical," he said, with a brief, dry, almost smile. "There is a woman in this town, Mrs. Adelaide Fry, who has been widowed 2 years and who has been leaving food on my porch since January. She has considerably more in common with the life I actually live than a woman from Pennsylvania who reads poetry." He stood. "I will have your trunk sent to the hotel for tonight. I trust you can make your own arrangements from there." She stood as well and extended her hand. "Mr. Holt, I am sorry for the disruption." He shook her hand. "Disruptions are frequently improvements in disguise," he said. "Good luck, Miss Vaughn." She walked out of the hotel and into the morning light of Salters Creek and across the boardwalk to the hitching post where Simon Winslow stood with the horses, and when she reached him he turned, and she saw in his face the question he would not ask. "He took it with considerable dignity," she said. "He always struck me as a man who valued his pride over his feelings," Simon said. "So yes, I imagine he did." "He said there is a widow in town who leaves food on his porch," she said. Simon's expression shifted to something that was very nearly a smile. "Adelaide Fry," he said. "She makes the finest pie in the territory. He will be considerably happier." Stella looked at him. The morning was bright and the street was full of the ordinary life of a frontier town, and the future was entirely, terrifyingly open. "I appear to have no destination," she said. "That is one way to look at it," he said. "What is another way?" He looked at her with those dark, careful eyes and the hint of something that was not a smile but was warmer than one. "You have all the destinations," he said. "Every single one is available. That's not a problem, Stella. That's the best situation a person can be in." She looked at him and felt the last of her composed armor become entirely unnecessary, because the person looking back at her already knew exactly who she was and had been looking at her that way for 3 days. "I need a job," she said, "and a place to stay." "The sheriff in Redrock Junction mentioned needing a school teacher," Simon said. "The position has been open 4 months. Nobody qualified has come through." "Are you suggesting I go back the way I came?" she said. "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that Redrock Junction has a good school and a sheriff who runs a fair town and a boarding house with a respectable landlady, and that I happen to be based there for the foreseeable future." She looked at him for a long moment. The horses stood patient in the morning sun. The town moved around them in its ordinary way. "3 days ago," she said, "I was engaged to a man I had never met. 3 days ago," he said, "I was simply doing a job." "And now?" she asked. He turned fully toward her, and the careful distance he had maintained for 3 days was simply gone, replaced by something open and direct and entirely sincere. "Now," he said, "I would very much like to ask if I might call on you properly, with your permission, in the town where I live and where you might be employed as a school teacher, through whatever process takes as long as you need and not a moment longer." She felt something rise in her chest that was not composure or practicality or the survival instinct she had been running on for the last year. It was something much simpler and much more frightening and much more wonderful than any of those things. "You may call on me," she said, "Simon." He smiled then, a full one, and it transformed his face in a way she had been waiting to see since she first noticed the potential of it in the corners of his eyes. "Then we should get back on the trail," he said. "The ride to Redrock Junction is 3 days. "I know," she said. "I have done it already." "You'll find the second time around is considerably more enjoyable," he said. "Is that so?" "The company is the same," he said, "but the context is substantially better." She laughed, a real one, bright and unguarded, and Simon Winslow looked at her with an expression that said he would be content to hear that laugh for as long as the world allowed. And Stella Vaughn, who had come west with a trunk full of hope and an arrangement that was never going to fit her, felt the strange and extraordinary sensation of something beginning rather than ending. They rode north out of Salters Creek under a wide blue sky, the pack horse trotting steadily now on its properly shod foot, Biscuit moving with her easy, comfortable gait, and the desert spread around them in every direction with its ancient, patient beauty, as indifferent and as magnificent as it had always been. The second journey north was, as Simon had promised, considerably different from the first. For one thing, the pretense was gone. The careful formality of the first day had been stripped away by honesty, and in its place was something natural and warm and occasionally very funny, because it turned out that Simon Winslow had a dry and precise sense of humor that had been largely suppressed under the obligations of the professional escort, and Stella had a quick and irreverent wit that had been suppressed under the obligations of the prospective wife, and between the two of them, unmasked, they were genuinely good company. They talked for hours. Not the tentative, revealing conversations of the first journey south, though there was more of that too, but the easy, ranging conversations of two people discovering the pleasure of a well-matched mind. She told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about her father's bookshop, and the way she had spent her Saturdays reading in the back among the shelves, about her mother who could recite Shakespeare from memory and bake bread with equal facility. He told her about his years with the Rangers, about the border country he had covered and the strange, violent, beautiful life of the frontier, about the people he had met who had been variously extraordinary and terrible, and usually some complicated mixture of both. They talked about the land itself, because it was impossible not to. The Arizona Territory was the kind of place that demanded to be discussed, that threw up new wonders and new challenges with every mile. Simon knew its history with the depth of a man who had spent years learning a place by living in it, and he told her about it with a quiet passion that she found herself completely absorbed by. He told her about the Hohokam, the ancient people who had built canals through this desert 1,000 years before any European had ever heard of it, who had understood the land with an intimacy that no newcomer had yet matched. He told her about the Apache and the terrible history of what had been done to them, the treaties broken, the land taken, the violence perpetrated in the name of settlement, and he spoke about it with a moral clarity and a lack of comfortable justification that she respected enormously. He had seen it up close, had ridden through the results of it, had been ordered more than once to enforce policies he believed were unjust. "Is that another part of why you left Texas?" she asked. "Part of it," he said. "The law out here does not always mean justice. Sometimes those two things are so far apart from each other that you have to decide which one you're actually trying to serve." "And which did you choose?" she asked. "I chose the one that let me sleep," he said. She looked at the country around her, this land that had been home to people long before the people she came from had any relationship with it, and felt the weight and the complexity of being here at all. "It is extraordinary country," she said. "Even with all of it, even with the history of it, it is still extraordinary." "It's the best and worst thing about this territory," he said. "The beauty of it makes it possible to pretend everything is simpler than it is, but the beauty is also honest about itself. It doesn't apologize for being what it is." She looked at him. "Neither do you," she said. He looked back at her. "No," he said. "I try not to." They made camp the second night at Archer's Spring again, the cottonwoods silver in the evening breeze and the spring murmuring its small music. And this time they sat on the same side of the fire, not pressed together, but close enough that the air between them was warm, and the conversation did not require either of them to raise their voice. She had her book of poetry, and at his request she read aloud from it, her voice carrying through the quiet desert night with the sound of a person speaking in their natural register, unhurried and unhidden. He listened with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the fire with the attention of a man for whom listening was not a passive act. When she finished a poem about returning home to a place that had changed, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Read it again." She read it again. "My mother used to say," he said after, "that home isn't the place you were born, it's the place you recognize yourself." She lowered the book. The fire was low and warm. The cottonwoods whispered. The spring played its small, continuous note. "Then I have not had a home in some time," she said. He turned to look at her, and his face in the firelight was very close and very open. "I think," he said, "that might be in the process of changing." She held his gaze. "You are very certain for a man who has known me 3 days and approximately 1 return journey." "I am certain of very few things," he said. "When I am certain of something, I tend to know it clearly. And you are certain of this." She said, and the question held everything, not just the immediate thing between them, but all of it, the future, the uncertainty, the risk. "I am certain," he said, "that I have not been this sure of anything since I was 25 years old and I thought I knew exactly how everything would go." He paused. "That certainty was taken from me, and I spent 4 years not trusting it again." He looked at her steadily. "This feels different. This feels like the kind of certain that is built out of something real rather than something wished for." She set the book down on the ground beside her and looked at him. This man who had started as a hired escort and had become, over the span of 6 days in the desert, something that she did not yet have the right word for, but that she recognized with her whole self. "I am also certain," she said quietly, "of something I did not anticipate being certain of when I left Pennsylvania." He was very still. "And what is that?" "That I would rather spend one more day on this trail with you," she said, "than a comfortable lifetime in a house where nobody looks at me the way you look at me." He reached out and took her hand, the burned one that was only slightly pink now, and held it in both of his the way he had that first time, carefully and with complete attention, and this time he did not let go. "Stella," he said. "Simon," she said. The fire burned quietly between them, and the stars turned overhead, and the spring played, and the cottonwoods moved in the dark. And he leaned forward, and she leaned forward, and the first kiss they shared was something so gentle and so honest that it felt less like an event and more like a recognition, like coming across something in the dark that you had been looking for without quite knowing its name. The return journey took them back through Mesquite Crossing, where Ambrose Prout observed them riding side by side and gave a short nod that contained within it a complete editorial, and then north through the canyon country in the easy warmth of the desert morning, talking and being quiet with equal comfort. And when Redrock Junction appeared in the distance on the third afternoon of the return journey, Stella felt her heart lift and catch in her throat simultaneously. She had left this place 4 days ago as a woman with a destination, and arrived with none of the things she had expected and all of the things she had not. She was returning with no arranged future, no fiancé, no settled plan, and precisely one human being who looked at her with absolute clarity and made her feel like the person she actually was. She found this, on balance, a significant improvement. Marshall Greer, who was a large and bearded man in his mid-50s with the permanent expression of a man who had seen everything and had opinions about most of it, met them at the edge of town and looked at the absence of Stella's settled demeanor and the presence of a different quality in the air between her and Simon, and said only, "How was the ride?" "Eventful," Simon said. "She need a room at Mrs. Crane's." "For the moment," Simon said. "Miss Vaughn has expressed interest in the school position." The marshal looked at Stella with an appraising and not unkind eye. "You qualified." "I am educated and patient and genuinely interested in teaching," she said, "which I understand is 3 qualities the last applicant lacked." "The last applicant," the marshal said, "lasted 4 days before deciding the desert was not to his liking and heading back east." He scratched his beard. "Come by the office tomorrow morning. We'll talk terms." He walked away, and Stella looked at Simon, and Simon looked at Stella, and the sun was going down behind the red hills to the west, and the town of Redrock Junction was arranging itself in the golden light of the end of the day, and it was not elegant and it was not large, and it was approximately 1,000 miles from everything she had grown up with. It felt, she thought, like a place where she might recognize herself. Mrs. Crane at the Juniper House gave her the same room she had occupied 4 nights ago with the same narrow bed and the same sound of the desert wind. But the room felt different now, not because anything about it had changed, but because Stella herself had. She sat on the bed and looked at her trunk, which contained the sum of her possessions, and made a methodical accounting of her situation. She had enough money for 2 weeks' board while she waited to be hired. She had the book of poetry. She had her skills and her education, and the genuine interest in children that had characterized her since she had helped run Sunday school in her father's church at 16. She had the frank and honest attention of a man who was worth having the attention of. On balance, she had more than she had come west with. She slept deeply that night and woke in the early morning to the smell of coffee from downstairs and the sound of the town beginning its day. And when she came down to the dining room, she found Simon already there, eating breakfast with the focused appetite of a man who had been on the trail and was grateful for a proper table. He stood when she came in, and she waved him back down and sat across from him, and Mrs. Crane brought her coffee and eggs without being asked, and they ate together in the morning light streaming through the dining room window, easy and unhurried, and Stella thought that this, the ordinary morning this, was somehow as significant as any of the extraordinary moments on the trail. "I have been thinking," she said over her second cup of coffee. "I have been thinking too," he said. "The situation is unusual," she said. "I arrived here to be delivered to a different man. I did not stay." I have no formal place here. I intend to apply for the school position which may or may not be offered. I will need several months to establish myself, whatever happens." "Yes," he said. "I want to be clear," she said, looking at him directly, "about what I am not saying. I'm not saying that I want to go slowly out of doubt. I do not have doubts about what I feel. She paused. "I have a great deal of respect for doing things properly, not because of what anyone else would think, but because it is the way I do things." "I would have it no other way," he said, and he meant it. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." "We understand each other," he agreed. He called on her that evening, and they walked the length of Redrock Junction's main street and back, which took approximately 15 minutes, and then sat on the bench outside the Juniper House, while the evening cooled and the sky turned the colors that the Arizona sky turned, and the stars came out, and they talked until Mrs. Crane came to the door and pointed meaningfully at the time. Simon stood and took Stella's hand and held it for a moment, looking at her in the way he had, that direct and honest regard that she was beginning to think she would never entirely get used to in the best possible way. "Good night, Stella," he said. "Good night, Simon," she said. She went upstairs and stood at her window and looked at the street below and felt, rising in her like the sun over the red hills, something vast and warm and entirely her own. The teaching position was offered the following morning. The schoolroom was a rough-hewn building at the north end of town that held 14 children ranging from 6 to 14 years old, a collection of salvaged textbooks, a blackboard that had seen better days, and a supply of chalk that needed replenishing. Stella looked at all of it with the eye of a person who had grown up in a bookshop and understood that the right tools in the right hands were something you built over time. She accepted the position. The children of Redrock Junction were, as frontier children generally were, practical and observant and not easily impressed. The 6-year-old, a girl named Pearl whose father ran the dry goods store, asked Stella on the first day whether she was going to stay or run away like the last teacher, and Stella said she was going to stay, and Pearl looked at her for a long moment with the judicial gravity of a 6-year-old taking a measurement, and then sat down at her bench and opened her primer. Stella taught with everything she had. She had always known she was good at it, had suspected it since the Sunday school days, but here in this rough-hewn room with its 14 pairs of eyes, she found something that felt like vocation, like the matching of a person to a purpose that fit their exact shape. She taught reading and arithmetic and some history, and she taught it with the conviction that knowledge was the most portable and useful thing a person could carry into an uncertain world, and the children responded to her with a seriousness that she took as the most sincere compliment she had ever received. Simon came to the schoolroom the first Friday afternoon to walk her home, and Pearl looked at him with the same judicial gravity she had applied to Stella and said, "Are you Miss Vaughn's man?" Simon looked at Stella. Stella looked at Simon. "I am working on it," Simon said, seriously. Pearl considered this and seemed to find it a satisfactory answer. The weeks that followed were the most uncomplicated weeks Stella had experienced in years, which was not to say they were without difficulty, because the frontier was not without difficulty by its nature, but the difficulties were real and manageable, and she was not facing them from a position of isolation or desperation. She moved out of Mrs. Crane's boarding house into a small rented cabin at the edge of town that the marshal's office helped her furnish with the bare necessities, and she made it hers with the efficiency of a woman who had been making do with what was available since her 20s, which resulted in a space that was small but warm and had 2 shelves of books, some borrowed and some of her own, above the fireplace. Simon took his calling seriously, in the way he took most things. He came on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and on Sunday afternoons, and they sat on the porch of her cabin, or walked the trails around the town's edge, or sat in the common room of the Juniper House when the weather was bad. And they talked always, with the ease and pleasure of 2 people for whom conversation was never an obligation but a genuine ongoing delight. She learned him in the way you learn a person through accumulation, through 100 small revelations and 100 observations of how a person moves through the world. She learned that he was meticulous about his horse and casual about his personal comfort. She learned that he had strong opinions about the quality of bread and no opinions whatsoever about the quality of his sleeping arrangements. She learned that he was genuinely kind to people who expected nothing from him and quietly impatient with people who expected too much, and that the line between those two categories in his judgment was drawn very fairly. She learned that he still thought about the woman he had lost 4 years ago in San Antonio, and that he carried that grief with a kind of quiet fidelity that was not incompatible with love, but was honest about its presence, and she found that she trusted him more for not pretending otherwise. He learned her in return. He learned the signs of her enthusiasm, the way her hands moved when she was describing something she cared about, and the signs of her worry, the particular stillness that meant she was running through a problem in her head. He learned that she had a stubborn streak that she was entirely aware of and only partially in control of, and that when she was wrong about something, she acknowledged it with a directness that he found more refreshing than almost any other quality. He learned that she had been lonelier in the years before coming west than she had admitted in any letter or conversation, that the death of her parents and the loss of the bookshop had stripped away the primary relationships of her adult life and left her in a kind of functional solitude that she had managed with competence and without self-pity, but that had cost her considerably. He told her, one Thursday evening in October when the desert was cooling toward winter and the sky above the red hills was full of cold stars, that he loved her. He said it with no preamble and no qualification, simply the 3 words in his direct voice, looking at her on the porch of her cabin with the lamp burning in the window behind her. She was quiet for a moment that was not uncertainty, but simply the moment of something large landing fully. "I love you too," she said. "I have been aware of it for approximately 7 weeks." He looked at her with that expression she knew now, that warm and steady regard. "7 weeks," he said. "That is very precise. I was keeping a kind of accounting," she said, "to determine whether what I was feeling was genuine or a response to circumstances. And your conclusion—" "Both," she said. "It began with circumstances and became something entirely its own." He stood and crossed to her and took her face in his hands with the same care he brought to everything, and kissed her in the lamplight with the cold October stars overhead and the desert going quiet all around them, and she leaned into it with her whole self. He asked her to marry him at Christmas. He did it properly, meaning that he had spoken first with Marshal Greer, who was the closest thing to a family elder available in the territory, and had procured a ring, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that he had made at the jeweler's in Tucson, which turquoise being a stone of the desert and therefore, he told her, suited to them both. He asked her in the schoolroom, which was where she was when he arrived, because Pearl had stayed late with a difficulty in fractions and Stella had stayed with her until it was resolved. And when Pearl left and Simon knocked on the door and came in with his hat in his hand and the ring in his pocket, the schoolroom was lit by the last afternoon light coming through the western window, and the blackboard still had a fraction problem chalked on it. He went down on one knee on the rough plank floor and asked her, in the simplest and most direct words available to him, to be his wife. She said yes before he had quite finished the sentence. He put the turquoise ring on her hand and stood, and she kissed him, and the fraction problem watched from the blackboard with mathematical impassivity. They were married in the spring, in the smaller of the town's 2 churches, the one with the fresh white paint that Stella had noticed on her first ride through town. The ceremony was performed by the minister, Reverend James Elwood, a thin and earnest man from Ohio, who had come west with the same combination of faith and adaptability that the territory demanded of everyone. The witness were Marshal Greer and Mrs. Crane, and Pearl from the school sat in the front pew and watched the proceedings with the intense focus of a child who was not missing a detail. Stella wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had ordered from Tucson, which was not white because white was impractical in the desert, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Simon had ridden 2 miles to gather that morning, which included the particular yellow flower that grew on the mesa walls and that she had told him, back on the trail in the first days, she thought was beautiful. He had remembered. He wore his best clothes, which were not extraordinary, and his boots, which were the good ones, and he stood at the altar and watched her walk down the aisle with an expression that Pearl later told her teacher had looked like the man was seeing the sun come up for the first time. Stella had laughed at that and agreed that it was probably accurate. The reception was held in the common room of the Juniper House, where Mrs. Crane had produced a wedding supper of remarkable quality given the available resources, and half the town came, because Red Rock Junction was the kind of place where a schoolteacher's wedding was a community event, and because Stella had become, in the months she had been there, genuinely beloved by people who valued competence and directness, and the particular warmth of a person who was genuinely interested in other people. Simon danced with her, which surprised her slightly, because she had not known he could dance, and he was good at it, the kind of good that came from having grown up in Georgia before the war stripped away most of the social forms that taught young men such things. "Where did this come from?" she said, as they moved in the small clear space the townspeople had made for them. "I had a mother who believed that dancing was a necessary skill," he said. "She was right," Stella said. "She was right about most things," he said. "She would have been very interested in you." "Would she have approved?" Stella asked. He looked at her steadily, his hand warm at her waist. "She would have said," he said, "that I had better not let you get away." They went home to the cabin that night, which was his now as much as hers, and the turquoise ring was on her hand, and the desert was full of spring, and the stars were extraordinary, and everything was settled and beginning, and large and real. They had a year of just themselves before the family began to expand, a year that was full of the ordinary, extraordinary life of the frontier, of seasons changing over the desert in their dramatic way, of the schoolroom and the marshal's duties and the long evenings on the porch, and the longer nights with the desert wind at the windows. A year was enough to cement something in both of them that was as solid and as honest as the red rock of the canyon country, a knowledge of each other that had no performance left in it, only the genuine article. Their son was born in the following spring. He arrived in the early morning of a day in April when the desert was in bloom, the prickly pear throwing out its improbable scarlet flowers and the brittle bush covering the hillsides in gold, as though the land had decided to celebrate the occasion in its own terms. Mrs. Crane served as midwife, being the most experienced woman in town for the purpose, and Simon spent the hours of labor in the front room of the cabin being, as Mrs. Crane put it with some affectionate exasperation, useless in the dedicated way of new fathers everywhere. When the baby was brought to him, a solid and loudly opinionated boy with dark hair, and an expression of profound irritation at the general situation of being born, Simon held him with the careful, complete attention he brought to everything, and was quiet for a long time. Then he carried the baby to where Stella lay, exhausted and luminous in equal measure, and sat beside her on the edge of the bed and held the baby between them. "What do we call him?" she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about my father." "Tell me about him," she said. "His name was Thomas," Simon said. "He was a school teacher, ironically enough, before the war. He believed that every person, regardless of circumstance, deserved to be educated." Stella looked at the baby, at his dark hair and his furious little face, and felt something so enormous and so simple that it nearly undid her entirely. "Thomas Winslow," she said. "Thomas," Simon confirmed, and his voice was low and warm and had in it 4 years of grief and 6 days on a desert trail and everything that had followed. Pearl, when she came to see the baby the following week, inspected him with her characteristic thoroughness and pronounced him acceptable, which Stella and Simon both received as high praise. Thomas Winslow grew in the way children grow in the desert, fast and strong, and with a particular intensity of interest in the world around him, his dark eyes taking in everything with the same observant quality his father had always carried. By the time he was 3, he was following Simon around the stable demanding explanations for things and following Stella around the schoolroom demanding different explanations for different things. And both of his parents answered him with the same directness they brought to everything, because both of them believed, with the conviction of people who had needed knowledge to survive, that children deserved honest answers. The school grew too. 2 years after Stella had taken the position, a second teacher was hired and the schoolroom expanded into a second building, and the children of Junction had access to an education that was, by the standards of the territory, genuinely good. She was proud of it in the uncomplicated way of a person whose work matched their purpose. Simon was made the full marshal of Junction when Marshal Greer retired. In the autumn of the year Thomas turned 4, in a ceremony that consisted mainly of Greer handing Simon the badge and saying, "Don't embarrass me," and Simon saying he would do his best. He did better than his best. He was the kind of lawman who believed that justice and the law needed to be the same thing wherever possible, and where they diverged, he was honest about the divergence. He was respected, not feared, which was the harder and better thing to be. When Stella was with child again, the following spring, she told Simon on the porch in the evening when Thomas was already asleep and the desert was going gold in the late light, and she handed him a cup of coffee and said, "Thomas is going to require company." Simon set down the coffee and looked at her with that steady, warm, complete regard. "When?" he said. "Late autumn," she said. He reached out and took her hand and held it in both of his, the way he had on the first night on the trail, and she felt the years between that night and this one settle into something so solid and so right that she could not imagine the world she had been moving through before she had arrived in Junction on a stage with a trunk full of hope, and found a man leaning against a hotel post who had absolutely no idea what the next 3 days were going to be. Their second child was a girl, born in October when the desert was cooling and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone to gold. They named her Clara, for no particular reason except that the name felt like itself when they said it, and Clara arrived with considerably less objection to the world than Thomas had, and settled into family life with a placidity that made Thomas, who had been the most attended-to person in the household for 4 years, view her with a deeply suspicious affection. He came to terms with her relatively quickly, as children generally do when the alternative is not having a playmate, and by the time Clara could walk, they were inseparable in the way of siblings who are each other's primary universe, and Stella would sometimes stand in the door of the yard and watch them and feel the fullness of it press against her ribs. Junction was not the life she had come west to find. It was not the life that had been arranged for her, and it was not the life she had imagined in Pennsylvania, in the back of her father's bookshop with a novel open on her lap and the world safely at a distance. It was the life she had actually built, out of a burned hand and a book of poetry and 3 days on the Arizona Trail, and the specific, irreplaceable experience of being looked at honestly by a person worth being honest with. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Simon brought her wildflowers again, the yellow mesa flowers, a considerable armful of them this time, and she put them in a jar on the kitchen table and looked at them and then at him and said, "Do you remember what you said on the rise above Salters Creek, the morning I went to speak with Gerald Holt?" "I remember everything from those 3 days," he said, with the directness that had always been one of the things she loved most about him. "You said I had all the destinations," she said. "Every single one was available." "I remember," he said. She looked at the flowers on the table, at the cabin they had built into a home, at the yard where their children were currently involved in some complicated negotiation with Pearl's younger brother about the rules of a game, at the schoolroom visible at the north end of town, at the red hills beyond it and the wide blue sky above it all. "You were right," she said. He came to stand behind her and put his arms around her and rested his chin on the top of her head, and she leaned into him in the completely easy way of two people who know each other's bodies as well as they know their own. "I am right about most things," he said, with the precise and quiet humor that she had been falling in love with for 5 years. "Do not let it make you insufferable," she said. "You would not allow it," he said. "No," she said, "I would not." Outside in the yard, Thomas and Clara had resolved their negotiation with Pearl's brother, and the game, whatever it was, had been resumed with the full commitment of children who understood that play was the most important work available to them. The desert afternoon was warm and golden, and the flowers on the table were the yellow of the mesa walls, and somewhere out in the territory the trail ran still, from Redrock Junction south through the canyon country, and the cottonwoods at Archer's Spring and the red walls of Redwall Mesa, and down into the valley where Salters Creek sat in its ordinary life. A trail Stella had ridden twice and would never forget and would not need to ride again. Because everything she had needed to find at the end of it had turned out to be walking beside her the whole way. Thomas came barreling through the back door with the absolute conviction of a 7-year-old who has something urgent to report. "There is a lizard on the fence post," he announced, and Clara tried to catch it. "Did she succeed?" Simon asked. "No," Thomas said with the judicial gravity that Stella had noted he had entirely inherited from his father. "The lizard had better strategy." "That is generally the situation with lizards," Simon agreed. Thomas considered this for a moment and then said, "Papa, can we go to the spring tomorrow, the one you told me about with the cottonwoods?" Simon looked at Stella over Thomas's head, and she saw in his face everything she always saw, the warmth and the steadiness, and the particular quality of a man who was fully, contentedly, gratefully present in his own life. "We can," he said, "all 4 of us. We will bring the horses and make a day of it." Thomas accepted this with satisfaction and went back out the door, and the yard filled again with the sound of children, and the warm afternoon continued its long golden decline toward evening, and Stella stood in her kitchen with the man she had not been looking for, and the life she had not been expecting, and the knowledge, as clear and solid as Arizona rock, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, even though the route to this particular destination had been, to say the least, entirely unplanned. She turned from the window and found Simon watching her with that expression, the one Pearl had called seeing the sun come up for the first time, and she walked to him and he met her halfway, because that was how they had always done things, and the desert evening came on outside in all its enormous, faithful beauty, and the yellow flowers stood in their jar on the kitchen table. And outside in the yard, Thomas was explaining lizard strategy to Clara with the complete authority of a person who had learned it from someone worth learning from. And all of it, every single piece of it, was exactly and completely and thoroughly right.